Keep going, don't look down. It's shaking, move faster. Run!
Everything you know about safety is an illusion. You wake up in a temperature-controlled room. You drive on paved roads and you assume the planet was designed for your comfort. It was not. The Earth does not care about your existence. In fact, large portions of this rock are actively trying to kill anything that sets foot on them. Yet instead of walking away, human beings have a strange, stubborn habit of looking at a total death trap and deciding to build a house on it. Today, we are stripping away the tourist brochures to look at the raw, unforgiving mechanics of survival. We are examining distinct levels of geographical hostility. These are places where altitude, pressure, temperature, and fluid dynamics push the human body and modern engineering past their breaking points. We will look at concrete structures built to withstand total geological collapse and isolation so absolute that a simple mechanical failure means permanent erasure. Welcome to the corners of the globe, where the margin for error is exactly zero. We begin with a mechanism of mass destruction masquerading as a waterway. The Yellow River in China is not a normal river. It is the most sediment-laden body of water on Earth, carrying 1.6 billion tons of silt every single year. As this heavy mud-thick water slows down across the eastern plains, the silt drops to the bottom. Over centuries, this constant dumping raises the riverbed higher and higher. To keep the water from spilling over, engineers have been forced to build levees progressively taller. The result is a terrifying feat of accidental engineering known as a suspended river. Today, sections of the Yellow River flow completely above ground, sitting 30 feet higher than the surrounding cities and farmland. Millions of people live directly beneath billions of gallons of rushing water held back only by earthen and concrete walls. When those walls fail, the math is catastrophic. In 1887, a series of dike breaches wiped out thousands of square miles, killing an estimated 900,000 to 2 million people in a matter of weeks. In 1938, the levees were intentionally blown up as a military tactic to halt an invading army drowning another 500,000. Engineers must continuously dredge the channel and reinforce the banks with heavy machinery fighting an endless battle against fluid dynamics. It is an infrastructure nightmare that drains billions from the economy just to maintain the status quo. This is not a landscape feature. It is a massive suspended water bomb waiting for a structural failure. To live here is to accept that your daily life depends entirely on the tensile strength of a dirt mound holding back the weight of a diverted ocean. But if the Yellow River shows what happens when water rises above civilization, our next destination shows what happens when civilization is buried beneath ice. If you want to see what happens when humans fight a war against absolute zero, look at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. This is not a research camp. It is a $150 million survival machine locked in a freezer where temperatures plunge to minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The infrastructure here is not designed to harmonize with nature. It is built to defy it. Snow accumulates rapidly at the pole, burying anything left on the surface. To prevent the station from becoming a frozen tomb, the entire 65,000 square foot complex sits on massive steel columns equipped with hydraulic jacks. As the ice rises, the building literally cranks itself upward step by step to stay above the crushing weight of the shifting snowpack. From mid-February to late October, the sun drops below the horizon, plunging the station into 6 months of uninterrupted pitch-black darkness. During this time, aircraft engines fail because jet fuel turns into a gel. Hydraulic fluid solidifies. Steel becomes brittle and shatters under stress. Because of this, once the winter begins, all rescue flights are effectively impossible. The crew of around 40 engineers, mechanics, and scientists are completely cut off from the rest of the human race. If the station's primary power grid fails, they have a backup. If the backup fails, the cold will breach the insulated walls, and the ambient temperature inside will match the deadly environment outside within a few short hours. There is no running away. There is no calling for backup. Survival relies entirely on diesel generators running continuously, maintained by mechanics who know that a single frozen pipe can trigger a cascade failure that kills everyone inside. Every bolt and wire in this facility is a lifeline, and the people maintaining them carry the weight of that reality every single day. At the South Pole, machines fight cold. In Ethiopia, the human body fights heat itself. We shift from the coldest extreme to a geological furnace. The Danakil Depression in Ethiopia sits roughly 400 feet below sea level. Here, 3 tectonic plates are actively tearing apart, ripping the Earth's crust open and exposing the magma beneath. The groundwater is heated by this shallow magma rising to the surface as boiling acid lakes that hit 212 degrees Fahrenheit. These pools are saturated with iron sulfur and salt, creating an incredibly toxic environment where a single misstep into the water will dissolve human flesh. Ambient air temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. In this heat, human sweat evaporates instantly, pulling moisture from the body so fast that severe dehydration and kidney failure can set in within hours. Yet humans endure this daily. Local Afar miners walk for days into this hostile basin, not for scientific research, but for brutal economics. They extract slabs of solid salt from the dried lake beds by hand. Using simple wooden sticks and heavy iron axes, they pack the heavy blocks onto camel caravans and march back out across the cracked earth. There is no heavy machinery here, no air-conditioned break rooms, and no medical support waiting in the wings. The dust scars their lungs, and the intense glare of the sun off the white salt flats permanently damages their corneas over time. They do it because salt is currency, and extreme poverty leaves no room for comfort or safety protocols. The Danakil Depression operates like a hostile alien planet demanding total physical submission and breaking the bodies of anyone trying to extract its resources. Fluid dynamics can turn water into a blunt force weapon, and nowhere is this more evident than the Qiantang River in China. Every autumn, the gravitational pull of the moon and sun creates a massive tidal surge in the East China Sea. This surge is forced into the narrowing funnel-shaped estuary of the river, violently reversing the river's natural flow. The result is a tidal bore a solid wall of advancing water that can reach 30 feet in height and travel upstream at speeds up to 25 miles per hour. This is not a wave U-surf. It is a highly pressurized hydraulic bulldozer. When this immense mass of water hits the concrete embankments and seawalls along the river, it generates a crushing impact force of up to 7 tons per square meter. It easily shatters concrete barriers, rips steel reinforcements out of the ground, and routinely sweeps heavy vehicles and onlookers directly into the churning current. Engineers have spent decades and millions of dollars constructing reinforced seawalls to absorb the shock. Yet the river repeatedly exploits the slightest structural weaknesses, fracturing the infrastructure with relentless kinetic energy. The water carries dense silt and debris, making it abrasive and lethal to anything caught inside the turbulence. If you are pulled under, you do not drown in clean water, you are battered by sediment and dragged across the riverbed. The Qiantang tidal bore is a stark lesson in mechanical force. It proves that no matter how much concrete and steel you pour into the ground to protect a city, a sufficient volume of moving water will eventually break it. Imagine starting your truck in October and not turning the engine off again until April. Imagine living in a settlement where the local cemetery requires a bonfire to thaw the permafrost just to dig a grave. And where the moisture in your eyes can literally freeze if you blink too slowly. Welcome to Oymyakon, Russia, the coldest permanently inhabited place on the planet. We are not looking at a winter wonderland today. We are looking at the brutal mathematics of surviving minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit. In this remote corner of Siberia, normal engineering completely breaks down. Metal becomes so brittle, it snaps under stress like dry wood. Rubber tires shatter. At minus 90 degrees, the ambient air stops being a simple weather condition and becomes an active predator. Survival here is a constant, exhausting battle of thermodynamics. Take the local infrastructure. There is no such thing as a standard underground water main. The ground is permanently frozen solid to a depth of nearly 5,000 feet. Instead, heating pipes are run above ground, wrapped in heavy layers of insulation, and pumped with scalding water continuously. If the central coal-fired boiler plant ever fails, the pipes will freeze and burst within hours, rendering the entire town utterly uninhabitable. Transportation in this environment is strictly a matter of life and death. Truck drivers hauling heavy supplies along the frozen Kolyma highway, historically known as the Road of Bones, do not shut off their diesel engines for months at a time. Shutting down the engine means the oil turns into a solid block of thick gel. If a mechanical breakdown occurs out on the ice road, it is not an inconvenience. It is a fatal event. You cannot just wait inside the cab for a tow truck to arrive. The unheated cabin will drop to the outside temperature rapidly. Without an active heat source at minus 90 degrees, human blood begins to thicken, circulation slows to a crawl, and severe hypothermia takes over. Within 15 minutes of an engine dying, you are essentially a frozen statue. The mechanics who operate here do not carry standard toolboxes. They carry blow torches to thaw out steel axles and frozen brake lines before they can even put a wrench to them. To live and work in Oymyakon is to accept the grim reality that every running piece of machinery you operate is the only barrier keeping you from freezing solid. Navigation is usually about finding land, but on the southwestern edge of Africa, land is the absolute last thing a sailor ever wants to see. The coastline of Namibia operates as a relentless executioner of ships. Local indigenous tribes call it the land God made in anger. Portuguese explorers referred to it simply as the gates of hell. The mechanics driving this 300-mile stretch of death are purely atmospheric. The freezing Benguela current sweeps up from Antarctica and collides directly with the superheated air baking off the Namib Desert. This violent thermal clash produces a dense, impenetrable bank of fog that rolls heavily out over the Atlantic Ocean. Before modern radar and satellite navigation, a captain navigating these shipping lanes was practically sailing blindfolded into a trap. Once a vessel runs aground here, the ocean does not just break the hull apart. The desert actively consumes the wreckage. Powerful coastal winds continuously blow millions of tons of sand inland, physically shifting the shoreline westward year after year. Today, the rusted skeletal remains of massive cargo freighters whaling ships, and heavy tugboats sit stranded sometimes half a mile inland, completely swallowed by towering dunes. They sit as eerie monuments to maritime failure, their steel hulls stripped of paint and chewed down to the bare iron by relentless salt corrosion and daily sand blasting. For a shipwrecked crew, surviving the impact and making it to the beach was never a rescue. It was merely a delayed death sentence. Behind the crashing surf lies absolutely nothing but a massive wall of dry, shifting sand stretching inland for hundreds of miles. There is no fresh water, no timber for shelter, and ambient temperatures swing violently from freezing fog in the morning to triple-digit heat by the afternoon. To wash ashore on the Skeleton Coast was to face a grim mathematical certainty. The ship was destroyed, the radios were dead, and without an immediate search party, the crew would inevitably become a permanent part of the geology. Drop a pin in the dead center of the Taklamakan Desert, a wasteland so vast and lethal that its ancient name literally translates to the place where you go in but never come out. Welcome to Daria Boyi. A remote outpost sitting at the absolute edge of human endurance. Here, isolation is not a mere inconvenience. It is a brutal geographic reality. There are no paved highways leading to this community. Reaching the village requires a grueling 3-day expedition across towering, constantly shifting sand dunes. Drivers must navigate heavy 4-wheel drive trucks through a punishing off-road gauntlet just to deliver basic supplies. Out in this abrasive environment, a simple mechanical breakdown rapidly escalates into a fatal survival situation. So how does a civilization sustain itself in a sea of dead sand? The secret lies entirely underground. Daria Boyi exists purely because of the Keria River, a water source that flows down from distant mountains and vanishes directly into the desert floor, continuing its journey deep beneath the earth. To access this buried lifeline, the residents rely on the ancient populous Euphratica trees. These deeply rooted desert trees act as massive natural water pumps. The locals have mastered a centuries-old survival technique tracking the complex root systems of these trees deep into the sand to locate the hidden water table and extract trapped moisture. Living in Daria Boyi is a daily masterclass in extreme resourcefulness. There is no municipal water grid or modern infrastructure to rely on. The homes themselves are constructed from mud and tightly woven willow branches engineered specifically to withstand relentless abrasive sandstorms and brutal daily temperature swings. It is an uncompromising existence where every drop of water is earned through hard labor, proving that raw human mechanics and sheer willpower can conquer the most hostile environments on the planet. Position a map over the high Andes right on the border of Peru and Bolivia. Here sits Lake Titicaca, an enormous body of water situated at a breathless 12,500 feet above sea level. Constructing a permanent settlement in this thin, freezing air is a massive challenge on solid ground. The Uros people bypassed the shore entirely and built their civilization directly on the surface of the lake. They accomplished this without timber, concrete, or steel. The foundation of their world relies on the sheer mechanical strength of totora reeds, a highly buoyant aquatic plant native to these waters. The engineering behind these artificial land masses is a masterpiece of primitive survival, but it demands a brutal, never-ending cycle of manual labor. The builders begin by harvesting massive blocks of the reed's dense interwoven root system. They tightly bind these heavy root blocks together with ropes to form a base layer that measures up to 6 feet thick. Over this foundational grid, they stack thousands of dry reeds in alternating crisscross patterns to create a stable walking surface. Walking on it feels like treading on a giant, dense sponge, with the cold lake water occasionally seeping up around your boots. This organic real estate comes with a fatal biological flaw. The underside of the island sits perpetually in the freezing lake water and constantly rots away into the depths. To keep their homes from sinking, the residents are locked in an exhausting battle against decay. Fresh layers of dry reeds must be manually cut, hauled, and stacked on the surface every single week. If the labor stops, the island simply goes under. Maintaining buoyancy is only half the battle. These floating villages are subjected to intense alpine winds and relentless lake currents. To hold their exact position, the Uros utilize a heavy-duty anchoring system. They drive thick eucalyptus poles deep through the reed base, tying them off to massive stone anchors dropped directly to the lake floor. A failure in these mooring lines carries severe consequences. A snapped rope means an entire village could quietly detach in the darkness and drift straight across the international border into Bolivian waters. For centuries, this tribe has survived by engineering floating fortresses out of aquatic grass, proving that constant punishing maintenance is the only thing keeping them from the bottom of the lake. Drop a pin deep into the impenetrable jungles of the Indonesian province of Papua, a green hell where the humidity suffocates and the forest floor is a lethal zone of predators, flash floods, and rival warring tribes. Survival here means leaving the ground completely. Welcome to the territory of the Korowai people, a tribe that has mastered one of the most extreme forms of primitive engineering on the planet. They do not build their homes on the earth. They construct them suspended up to 100 feet in the air, anchoring their lives high in the canopy. Reaching these dizzying heights requires structural integrity, built entirely without nails, screws, or steel wire. The Korowai rely solely on raw jungle mechanics. They select a massive, sturdy banyan tree as the central pillar, stripping its crown to create a stable foundation. The floor and walls are crafted from split sago palm and bound together tightly with hundreds of yards of incredibly strong rattan vines. This natural lashing holds heavy wooden beams in place, creating a framework capable of supporting an entire extended family, swaying high above the jungle floor. The only access is a single notched wooden pole that serves as a precarious vertical ladder pulled up instantly at the first sign of a threat. Living at this altitude was born strictly out of tactical defense. Historically, the canopy provided the ultimate high ground against rival headhunting clans, isolating families from surprise nighttime ambushes. It also completely removes them from the threat of dangerous predators that stalk the damp earth and sudden catastrophic flash floods that regularly wipe out everything below. The most baffling mechanical challenge of this elevated existence is maintaining a working cooking fire inside a highly flammable wooden box. The Korowai engineer a specialized insulated fire pit suspended slightly above the woven floor. They pack the base tight with thick layers of wet clay and ash absorbing the intense heat of the flames. It is a brilliant high-stakes thermal barrier. If the clay cracks or the fire spreads, the entire structure becomes a towering inferno in seconds. It is a daily, uncompromising high-wire act, proving that raw human ingenuity can engineer survival in the most dangerous corners of the globe. Navigate to the remote rain shadow of the Himalayas deep within the Indian state of Himachal Pradesh. Here lies the Spiti Valley, a brutal high-altitude cold desert locked at 12,500 feet above sea level. Surviving in this jagged, barren landscape requires extreme physical endurance and mental grit. For 6 solid months of the year, winter clamps down with punishing force. Temperatures routinely plummet to 30 degrees below zero, and massive snowdrifts completely bury the mountain passes. The residents are entirely cut off from the rest of the human race, relying exclusively on whatever food and fuel they manage to stockpile during the brief, fleeting summer. Clinging precariously to a crumbling 1,000-foot rock spur above the confluence of 2 freezing rivers sits Dankar Monastery. Constructed more than 1,000 years ago, it served as both a spiritual command center and a highly defensible fortress for the ancient Spiti kings. The original builders did not have access to concrete steel or heavy machinery. Instead, they engineered this sprawling complex entirely out of rammed earth, mud, and timber hauled up the treacherous slopes. The resulting structure is functionally camouflaged, its brown and gray walls blending seamlessly into the sheer wind-eroded limestone cliff face. The architectural audacity required to build on this fragile pinnacle is staggering. But it comes with a fatal geological reality. The very rock supporting the heavy mud monastery is slowly disintegrating. Centuries of harsh alpine winds, minor earthquakes, and relentless freeze-thaw cycles have severely weathered the stone pillars holding up the foundation. The erosion is so severe that modern structural engineers have classified the site as highly endangered. Today, access to certain overhanging sections of the complex is strictly limited to just 20 people at a time to prevent a sudden catastrophic collapse into the valley below. Despite the constant threat of gravity and extreme weather, this mud fortress has held its ground for 10 centuries. It stands as a profound testament to the resilience of the men who engineered a permanent stronghold in one of the most hostile and isolated environments on the planet. Drop a pin onto the southeastern quadrant of Iceland, a frozen wasteland where the Earth crust wages a relentless war against millions of tons of crushing ice. Welcome to Vatnajökull, the largest ice cap in Europe. This is not just a dormant block of frozen water. It is a massive grinding machine resting directly on top of a highly volatile volcanic system. Venturing beneath this glacier reveals a temporary and highly unstable subterranean world. The famous blue ice caves of Vatnajökull are structural anomalies carved entirely by the force of nature. During the brief summer months, millions of gallons of meltwater act like an industrial drill, cutting deep, winding tunnels through the base of the glacier. When winter temperatures plummet, these rivers freeze or recede, leaving behind massive, hollowed-out caverns. The unnatural neon blue color of these cave walls is a direct result of extreme physics. Over centuries, the sheer, unimaginable weight of the glacier compresses the ice so intensely that all oxygen bubbles are forcefully squeezed out. This creates a hyper-dense ice structure that absorbs red light and reflects a deep, penetrating blue. Stepping inside these caves is a calculated risk. The ceiling, holding thousands of tons of heavy compressed ice, is being actively undermined from below. The active volcanoes resting directly underneath the glacier emit constant localized geothermal heat. This unseen thermal energy slowly weakens the structural integrity of the ice from the inside out. There is no reinforced steel or concrete here, just a fragile equilibrium of temperature and pressure. The layout of these caves changes constantly, and the threat of a sudden catastrophic collapse is a daily reality. It is a stark reminder that in this part of the world, geology does not stay still. Venture into the desolate expanse of the Qaidam Basin in northwestern China, a brutal and wind-scoured depression sitting 9,000 feet above sea level. Here lies the Karhan Salt Lake, a vast and blindingly white surface that holds a staggering 60 billion tons of minerals. You will not find liquid water here. Instead, extreme evaporation has left behind a solid crust so thick and resilient that human ingenuity has turned it into a heavy industrial corridor. Stretching straight across this barren wasteland is a 20-mile stretch of highway known as the 10,000 Jiang Salt Bridge. It is not a bridge suspended in the air. It is a fully functional high-capacity roadway built directly on top of the lake bed. There is no asphalt, no steel rebar, and no poured concrete. The surface vehicles drive on is made entirely of compressed crystallized salt. The structural integrity of this highway defies common sense. In most parts of the world, salt dissolves instantly upon contact with moisture, destroying anything built on top of it. But in the hyper-arid climate of the Kaidam Basin, rainfall is practically non-existent. Deprived of water, the high concentration of sodium chloride undergoes a relentless crystallization process. Over time, these mineral bonds interlock and harden to a density that rivals modern reinforced concrete. This natural pavement is incredibly tough. Every single day, massive 40-ton freight trucks and heavy industrial trains loaded with extracted minerals rumble across this salt highway without causing a single fracture. The maintenance of this road is just as unconventional as its construction. When a pothole does form, the road crews do not bring out heavy machinery and steaming hot tar. They simply pour a bucket of liquid brine into the cavity, let the fierce desert sun evaporate the water, and allow the salt to instantly recrystallize, patching the road with a bond as strong as solid stone. It is a flawless, self-repairing infrastructure born out of sheer geographical extremity, proving that sometimes the most durable engineering solutions are forged entirely by the Earth itself. Laying millions of tons of steel across the roof of the world is not a normal transportation project. It is a direct war against thermodynamics. At an elevation of 16,000 feet, the Tibetan Plateau operates under a brutal set of physical laws. The ground here is permafrost, a deep layer of soil, rock, and ice that has remained frozen for millennia. If you lay a conventional railway directly on top of this ice, you sign a death warrant for the entire infrastructure. A moving locomotive weighing thousands of tons generates immense kinetic energy and friction. That heat transfers straight through the steel rails, down through the ballast, and into the earth. The permafrost melts. The solid ground instantly turns into a massive, unstable swamp, and the tracks simply buckle, sending the train plummeting off the plateau. To force a railway across this wasteland, engineers had to actively manipulate the temperature of the planet. They did not just pour concrete. They installed a massive passive refrigeration network. Driven deep into the frozen earth alongside the tracks, are tens of thousands of metal tubes. These are thermosiphons, pressurized steel pipes filled with liquid ammonia. The mechanics are ruthless and brilliant. As the soil attempts to absorb heat from the tracks and the sun, the liquid ammonia at the bottom of the buried pipe absorbs that thermal energy and boils into a gas. This gas rapidly rises to the top of the tube, which extends high above the ground. Up there, the freezing high-altitude wind strips the heat away from the metal fins. The gas cools, condenses back into a liquid, and drops down to the bottom to repeat the cycle. This closed-loop system requires no electricity, no motors, and no moving parts. It functions entirely on physical laws, constantly sucking thermal energy out of the Earth and venting it into the atmosphere. It is a flawless mechanical solution to an impossible geographic problem, proving that when the Earth refuses to support human expansion, you force the ground into permanent submission. Imagine a hole in the Earth so massive and so deep that the sky above it weaponizes the air. Welcome to the frozen wastelands of eastern Siberia, where Soviet ambition ripped a 1,722-foot deep crater into the permafrost, creating an atmospheric vortex that literally swallows helicopters whole. This is the Mir mine. The sheer physical scale of this open-pit diamond mine breaks the local laws of aerodynamics. At almost 3/4 of a mile wide at the surface, the pit acts as a massive thermal anomaly. Freezing Siberian surface air rushes down into the gigantic stone bowl, while the latent heat from the deep earth warms the trapped air at the very bottom. That warmed air rises rapidly. The violent clash of these extreme temperature differences creates a ferocious and invisible downward draft. It is a churning, continuous vortex of dead air. If a pilot makes the fatal mistake of flying a helicopter directly over the center of the pit, the aircraft instantly loses all lift. The rotor blades beat uselessly against the falling column of air, and the multi-ton machine is sucked straight down into the rocky abyss. The Russian government had to establish a strict no-fly zone directly over the airspace just to stop losing aircraft to the crater. Digging this monstrous hole was an absolute engineering nightmare. Winter temperatures in this part of Siberia regularly drop below -40 degrees, freezing the ground so solid that standard steel excavator teeth would simply snap off. To fight the Earth, Soviet engineers had to use decommissioned jet engines mounted on the backs of heavy trucks. They would blast the permafrost with screaming jet exhaust just to soften the soil enough to drill holes. Then they packed those holes with dynamite and blew the Earth to pieces. They repeated this brutal, deafening process relentlessly for over 40 years. Why would anyone fight such a hostile environment? Because the dirt at the bottom of this crater was generating over $2 billion worth of raw diamonds every single year. At its absolute peak, the Mir mine was producing 20% of the world diamond supply, pulling massive wealth straight out of a frozen helicopter, swallowing pit in the middle of absolute nowhere. Building a city of 170,000 people in the deep Siberian Arctic is not a standard urban development. It is an act of sheer industrial defiance. 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle, the city of Norilsk operates under a brutal set of physical laws. Welcome to a place completely severed from the global road network, where the air burns the lungs and the endless winter plunges to a lethal -60 degrees Fahrenheit. There are no highways linking this urban fortress to the rest of Russia. Everything and everyone arrives by air or via a seasonal fleet of heavy icebreaker ships navigating the frozen Yenisei River. You do not end up here by accident. Norilsk exists for one absolute purpose: extracting the staggering wealth buried deep beneath the permafrost. The Earth here sits on the largest known deposits of nickel, copper, and palladium on the planet. This single isolated city generates a massive 2% of the entire Russian gross domestic product. Operating heavy machinery and running vast metallurgical smelting plants in these extreme conditions requires specialized engineering. When metal freezes to the point of turning brittle standard equipment simply shatters. The smelting furnaces burn constantly 24 hours a day, venting heavy metals and sulfur dioxide directly into the frozen atmosphere. The snow here sometimes falls black. The environmental toll is completely brutal, but the economic output is undeniable. Palladium from these frozen shafts is critical for catalytic converters and electronics worldwide, meaning global supply chains rely heavily on what is pulled out of this freezing wasteland. The men who work these subterranean mines and blast furnaces are playing a carefully calculated game of survival. They operate in a grueling environment, actively exchanging their physical health and life expectancy for massive paychecks and the ironclad guarantee of an early retirement. By age 45, many miners leave the Arctic for good, taking their accumulated hazard pay to buy a comfortable home in a much warmer climate. It is a relentless cycle of extreme labor, a heavy industrial machine running around the clock, proving that humans will endure the most unforgiving corners of the earth to force the ground into submission and conquer its buried resources. Deep in the remote Xinjiang region lies a wasteland so toxic and dry it resembles the surface of a dead planet. This is Lop Nur. Centuries ago, it was a massive, thriving body of water known to early explorers as the Wandering Lake. Today, it is a cracked, barren basin dubbed the Sea of Death. The natural disappearance of this water is a harsh geographical reality, but the true darkness of Lop Nur comes straight from the Cold War. For decades, this isolated expanse served as ground zero for Chinese nuclear ambitions. Starting in 1964, the military transformed the evaporated lakebed into an apocalyptic proving ground. Over the next 32 years, they detonated 45 nuclear weapons directly in this open desert. These classified operations included massive atmospheric drops and deeply buried underground explosions. The sheer force of these detonations permanently scarred the Earth and pushed radioactive fallout across the unpopulated dunes. Its absolute isolation made it the perfect theater for military escalation, completely shielded from Western surveillance. The environmental destruction of Lop Nur is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Long before the first atomic bomb was dropped, aggressive agricultural irrigation and dam projects had already strangled the rivers that fed the lake, turning a vibrant oasis into blowing dust by the early 1970s. The military simply took advantage of the freshly created wasteland. Today, the entire area remains a heavily restricted and dangerous zone. It stands as a chilling monument to heavy industry and military force. Lop Nur is a stark reminder of how quickly a thriving geographic landmark can be erased and replaced by a desolate landscape of hardened salt and radioactive craters. Abandoning an entire region the size of Rhode Island overnight is not a typical relocation. It is an act of sheer desperation. 80 miles north of the Ukrainian capital, the Chernobyl exclusion zone operates under an invisible and deadly set of physical laws. Welcome to a place permanently severed from human habitation, where the soil radiates silent poison and the crumbling architecture decays under the shadow of a historic nuclear catastrophe. Navigating this 1,000-square-mile perimeter requires specialized equipment and strict protocols. The threat here does not exist as a uniform blanket of radiation. It is a highly unpredictable minefield. Decades ago, the reactor explosion violently ejected isotopes like cesium-137 and strontium-90 into the atmosphere. Carried by erratic winds, these heavy elements did not simply wash away over time. They seeped directly into the topsoil, binding permanently with the earth and local water tables. A concrete pathway might be relatively clear, but the moss growing just an inch away can register massive radiation spikes on a dosimeter. Nature absorbed the absolute worst of this toxic fallout. Just downwind from the destroyed reactor sits a heavily contaminated area known as the Red Forest. The initial wave of extreme radiation swept through the native pine trees, causing them to immediately die and turn a stark rust color. Nearly 40 years later, the decaying timber still locks in massive amounts of radiation. Entering these woods remains strictly forbidden because the dirt kicked up by a simple footstep contains highly lethal microscopic particles. Scattered across this hazardous wilderness are the rusting remnants of Soviet military hardware. Massive heavy-lift helicopters, armored personnel carriers, and industrial earth-moving trucks sit abandoned in vast vehicle graveyards. These specific machines were rushed to the disaster site to dump sand and boron directly onto the burning exposed core. In the process, their thick metal hulls absorbed too much radiation to ever be decontaminated or safely driven again. Today, they are nothing more than decaying blocks of irradiated scrap iron sinking slowly into the overgrown grass. They serve as a stark, silent monument to the thousands of liquidators who plunged straight into a deadly hazard zone, trading their own life expectancy to seal a catastrophic fracture in modern engineering. In the remote Tigray region of Ethiopia stands a monolithic sandstone spire that demands the absolute limit of human endurance. This is Abuna Yamata Guh. Constructed in the 5th century, this rock-hewn church is not a place for the faint of heart. Reaching the entrance requires navigating a 2,500-foot sheer cliff face. There are no steel cables. There are no carabiners or safety harnesses. Local priests and determined travelers must scale the vertical rock face using nothing but their bare hands and bare feet. The natural footholds cut directly into the stone have been worn completely smooth by more than 15 centuries of continuous use. On this exposed precipice, one misplaced step or a sudden loss of grip guarantees a fatal drop. The final approach is a brutal test of nerves. It demands inching along a narrow stone ledge only a few handspans wide, with howling winds actively trying to pull climbers off the wall. Those who survive the brutal ascent squeeze into a small cavern, hollowed entirely by hand tools out of the solid rock. Inside, the air abruptly turns still and silent. The walls feature remarkably preserved ancient frescoes, and the resident monks guard heavy centuries-old manuscripts carefully bound in goat skin. The extreme isolation of Abuna Yamata Guh was a highly deliberate architectural strategy. It was engineered not just for deep spiritual meditation, but for absolute physical defense against historical raiders. The men who serve here treat the harrowing climb as a mundane commute. Many live their entire lives on this pinnacle, passing away and being laid to rest in small niches carved right into the cliff. It remains a staggering testament to early medieval masonry and a harsh environment where accepting ultimate personal risk is simply a daily requirement. Navigating the remote, mountainous terrain of northern Pakistan requires accepting a level of risk that modern infrastructure usually designs out of existence. Suspended high above the Hunza River is a crossing that completely ignores standard safety protocols. The Husseini Hanging Bridge is not a carefully engineered municipal project. It is a terrifying example of crude applied physics built by local villagers who simply needed a way to conquer a lethal geographic barrier. Spanning the width of a violent waterway, the bridge relies on the most basic mechanics of tension. It hangs from a series of rusting steel cables anchored directly into the raw stone of the valley. There are no redundant safety lines or regular load-bearing inspections here. The walking surface consists of nothing more than splintered wooden planks lashed to the cables with fraying ropes. These thin boards are not laid end to end. They are spaced up to 15 inches apart, forcing anyone crossing to look directly down into the churning rapids below with every single step. Traversing this structure is a severe test of balance and nerve because the environment actively works against you. High-altitude winds frequently rip through the valley, producing unpredictable gusts that can easily reach 40 miles per hour. When the wind strikes, the entire bridge violently sways and bucks, throwing off your center of gravity. You must maintain a vice grip on the weathered side cables because a single slip is fatal. The Hunza River below is fed by pure glacial meltwater. It is freezing incredibly fast and utterly unforgiving. Hitting the water guarantees immediate hypothermia and a current strong enough to pull a man under the rocks in seconds. Beside the current crossing hang the shredded remnants of an older bridge. It serves as a stark, visible reminder of what the brutal weather in this region does to steel and wood over time. Yet for the local population, crossing this decaying web of wire and timber is not a calculated adrenaline stunt. It is a necessary daily commute. They carry heavy loads of supplies across the swaying planks, trusting their lives to a precarious structure suspended by habit, necessity, and sheer willpower. In the vertical world of the Italian Dolomites stands a structure that completely defies common sense and gravity. This is not a cozy alpine tourist lodge. It is a brutal relic of the First World War. Suspended at an altitude of over 9,000 feet, the Bivacco Buffa di Perero is a brick and wood shelter shoved directly into a shallow cavity on a sheer rock face. During the fierce mountain conflicts of World War I, The elite Italian mountain troops known as the Alpini needed a covert vantage point to monitor Austrian forces. They did not just build a fort, they carved one into the living rock under the constant threat of enemy sniper fire, sub-zero temperatures, and lethal avalanches. Every plank of wood and every brick was hauled up by hand and pulley across impossible drops. It was constructed with the sweat and blood of young men who fought a grueling war where the freezing environment was just as deadly as the enemy artillery. Today, reaching this hanging bunker requires facing the exact same terrifying conditions those soldiers endured over a century ago. There are no roads or gentle hiking paths leading to its wooden doorway. The only way to access the shelter is by navigating a treacherous via ferrata. This translates to the iron path consisting of steel cables and metal rungs bolted straight into the vertical cliff. Climbers must physically pull themselves up thousands of feet of exposed limestone, where looking down means staring directly into an absolute abyss. Recently restored to serve as a survival refuge for modern mountaineers, the space is claustrophobically tight. Inside, there are just a few simple wooden cots and absolutely no amenities. There is no electricity. There is no running water. Just raw mountain rock forming the inner walls. It is a stark, freezing environment that commands absolute respect. The Bivacco Buffa di Perero stands as a haunting monument to the sheer grit of early 20th century military engineering and the incredibly harsh reality of high-altitude warfare. Deep in the heart of the Karakum Desert in Turkmenistan lies a blinding expanse of fire that was never meant to exist. This is not a natural volcano or a tectonic phenomenon. It is the direct result of a catastrophic industrial miscalculation made over half a century ago. In 1971, a team of Soviet engineers hauled their heavy drilling equipment into this unforgiving wasteland. They were hunting for lucrative natural gas deposits beneath the crust. But the ground beneath their massive rig was dangerously unstable. They had unknowingly positioned their operation directly over a massive subterranean cavern. Without warning, the thin crust of the earth collapsed. It swallowed the drilling rig, the camp, and all their equipment into a steep sinkhole nearly 230 feet across and almost 100 feet deep. The sudden collapse immediately began venting highly toxic methane gas into the atmosphere, threatening local wildlife and nearby nomadic desert communities. The engineers made a rapid and highly calculated decision. To prevent a wider environmental disaster, they deliberately threw a flare into the pit to set the crater on fire. The prevailing theory among the experts was that the highly combustible gas would simply burn itself out in a matter of weeks. They were entirely wrong. For more than 50 consecutive years, the Darvaza gas crater has burned without a single moment of interruption, sucking seemingly endless reserves of methane from deep within the earth. The pit generates a localized and perpetual inferno. Temperatures at the core regularly hit 1,000 degrees Celsius, producing a blistering physical heat that forces anyone to stay well back from the crumbling edge. Locals have aptly named it the Gates of Hell. It stands as a roaring, glowing monument to the unpredictable consequences of human engineering, and a stark reminder of what happens when man underestimates the raw, hidden power of the earth. Imagine driving on a crumbling dirt path carved into a sheer cliff face. There are no guardrails. The road is exactly the width of a Jeep tire. One slight miscalculation with the steering wheel drops you thousands of feet into a rocky gorge. And at the end of this terrifying drive waits a peak known simply as the Killer Mountain. Welcome to northern Pakistan. Today we examine how humans navigate and survive in the shadow of Nanga Parbat. Nanga Parbat stands at 26,660 feet, making it the 9th highest mountain on Earth. But altitude is only a fraction of the story. The climbing statistics here are brutally straightforward. For every 5 people who attempt to reach the summit, 1 never returns. The mountain does not forgive mechanical failures or human error. At the upper elevations, the atmosphere contains roughly 40% of the oxygen found at sea level. A human body begins to slowly suffocate the moment it enters this altitude. Every single step requires a monumental exertion of cardiovascular strength. To even reach the base camp, known ironically as Fairy Meadows, you must survive what civil engineers consider one of the most dangerous roads in the world. Built entirely by hand by local villagers decades ago, this 16-mile stretch of unpaved gravel clings precariously to the walls of the Raikot Valley. The local drivers who navigate this route do not rely on computerized modern vehicles. They operate battered, decades-old mechanical Jeeps. Driving here requires profound mechanical intuition. Engines are starved for oxygen and constantly at risk of overheating, while tires struggle for grip on loose shale. There is no reinforced concrete. No steel safety netting. Just loose rock gravity and the constant threat of massive landslides triggered by shifting glacial ice. The men who inhabit these remote, high-altitude outposts do not view this terrain as an extreme adventure. It is their daily reality. They transport heavy loads of firewood, basic rations, and building materials up these steep inclines simply to prepare for the brutal winter. They survive through highly adapted lung capacities and a relentless work ethic forged by generations of total isolation. When the heavy snows hit, they are completely cut off from civilization. Nanga Parbat strips away every modern comfort and tests the absolute mechanical and physical limits of survival. Mount Everest draws the commercial crowds and the international glory, but another peak in the Himalayas commands a far darker reputation. Standing at 26,545 feet, Annapurna. The first is the 10th highest mountain on the planet. Yet it holds an undisputed and chilling title. It is the deadliest mountain on Earth. For decades, seasoned climbers have flocked to Nepal seeking the ultimate alpine test. The statistics they face upon arrival are brutal. Historically, the fatality rate on Annapurna hovers around 32%. That means for roughly every 3 mountaineers who successfully reach the summit, 1 dies trying. This extreme mortality rate does not stem purely from the technical difficulty of the rock face. The true danger is the sheer structural unpredictability of the mountain itself. The architecture of the peak forms a treacherous labyrinth of unstable ice and overhanging glaciers. The primary threat comes from the seracs. These are colossal towers of dense glacial ice, often the size of large buildings that continually fracture and shift under their own immense weight. They sit like ticking time bombs, suspended thousands of feet above the main climbing routes. When a serac inevitably collapses, it triggers massive avalanches that sweep across the mountain faces with catastrophic force. There is no warning, and absolutely no human skill that can outmaneuver thousands of tons of falling ice and debris. Surviving the ascent of Annapurna is frequently less about physical endurance and more about playing a high-stakes game of Russian roulette with the volatile terrain. Even the most elite veteran mountaineers view an expedition here as a grim gamble against nature, where the mountain always dictates who gets to walk away. We build roads through solid rock and navigate ships through thick ice, believing we have conquered this world. But standing in the shadow of these deadly peaks reminds us of a cold and undeniable truth. The earth does not belong to us. We cannot tame it. We merely borrow it for a short while, and nature always has the final say. Yet human engineering refuses to surrender. When flesh and bone reach their absolute breaking point, we forge steel to push the boundaries of survival. Next time we examine the colossal mega machines tearing through the most unforgiving environments on the planet,